do. I'm terrible with the jingles.
We need a
terrible jingles, but this is today's What Would You Do? Bhavna, right, it's terrible. Yeah. Never mind. I don't care. All right, so this is the scenario. You hear a white co-worker say they aren't privileged because they grew up poor. Before you answer, it could be a friend, because we just talked a lot about privilege, very apt there, a white privilege. I talked about my own privilege and being different. So it could be a conversation with friends. And, you know, some of your friends are white. And what if one says, you know, I grew up poor, I'm not privileged. Like, what? How would you respond to that?
But from hearing that, I'd probably think to myself, well, their sense or their interpretation of the word of being privileged is through money, is through wealth. And that's what their blinkers are just on, that is having rights according to wealth. But having rights is really according to so many other factors, including race. And so I actually wouldn't open up that conversation with if it was a friend or a co-worker. I wouldn't respond with it opening up a can of worms. I may be inclined to put in there to comment, you know, privilege isn't just about wealth, and then to see what their response would be, and then navigate that conversation from there. But it would give me an idea, that particular comment would give me an idea, or even a judgment around what this person's perspective is.
Do you know what? I feel like I need to get on Twitter.
On entitlement.
That's so cool. You just made me think. I don't really interact on Twitter very much, but I really like that, what you just said, as I'm going to use that. I digress. I'm going to use that. We'll quite that. I'm going to use that. Privilege isn't just about wealth. I'm going to use that in a question. Okay. Thank you for that. But anyway, you're right. It isn't. And so I get the feeling, if I'm at work, if I was in my old workplace and I heard somebody say that, honestly, I'd be the same. I would not, I'd be like, oh, this is a can of worms. This is going to take up too much of my time. I am not going to go there right now. I would be the same.
Yeah.
If I was with friends, I would now, and there's a difference between me now and me in my 20s and me in my teens. Me now would say something. This is from the lean in. So this is the stats, and yes, it's in America, but we can totally translate this to Australia, Britain, Canada, different countries. The numbers might be slightly different.
What's the origin of a scenario?
So it's saying that this kind of thinking is fairly common. 63% of white Americans say they don't benefit much or at all from being white. Yeah, they believe that's what they say and that's what they believe. And it says when white people don't accept that there are benefits to being white, they cast doubt on the idea that racial inequality exists at all.
Yeah, because unless you've been exposed to it, you don't necessarily know. So it's like if you're someone of a white background and you're in discussions about white privilege, it's kind of like it's a difficult one, because for them, I would imagine, because why somebody being of a white background wouldn't have any exposure to much racism, and so for them to comment on even privilege, because they don't know what the other side is like, it's really difficult. And I suppose I'm going to bring it up the Harry and Meghan scenario again. This is what Harry is. As an example, I can give Harry. So Harry's been born a prince. It's clear it's white privilege. He's royal privilege, and he's been exposed to only that. And then in his 30s, he then enters into a relationship and chooses a life partner. So this isn't just a friend, but his life is now with somebody of color. And so now he's getting first-hand knowledge of responses of discrimination, of bigotry, of unfairness, of being treated unjustly. And it's the first time he's been exposed to it. So now he's able to comment on it. because he's had experience. So in that sense, the white person who's saying, oh, I don't feel privileged because I don't have enough money, or I've never felt privileged, or I've never felt an advantage because I'm white. They may have not been exposed to being a person of color.
I get that, but this is what I said. I said for some people need to feel it, touch it, experience it in order to understand it. But what just pops into my head is my mum's scenario. My mum is white, and my mum obviously decided to have a black partner, right? And she was disowned by her father. And the thing is, her father said to her, and this is just, if I remember correctly, from what my mum has told me, that your life is going to be very difficult. That's
what your granddad said to you.
Yeah, I don't want you to go into this relationship. Your life is going to be hard. And I don't approve.
And this is in the 1970s in the UK.
This is 1970.
Yeah,
in the UK, and actually in Northern Ireland, and there's actually not very few black people or people of any colour other than white in Northern Ireland. I mean, especially then. Now, definitely more for sure. But then, so the question is, well, how did he know that it was going to be difficult if he didn't have any friends of colour or different nationalities other than him being Irish and other people being maybe English? How did he know? And this is what I mean when you talk to the fact that because you're privileged, you don't understand the differences, the way people are treated. How did he know? And what I'm suggesting is, and this is pure speculation, is the media, things you see on TV, how people of colour are talked about, how
the press paint a picture.
How not just the press, but movies.
Yes.
You know, black people then are usually either slaves or criminals.
Yeah, it comes down to that unconscious bias.
Exactly.
So
to say that you can't know the differences in how they're treated because you haven't met someone, you don't have someone close to you in your life. I've struggled to believe that for that reason, because you have to be living without ever watching TV, films, or reading news to see what goes on and then form an opinion that either this group of people are bad and they only have these capabilities or whatever, you know, they're only criminals or they're not smart or whatever.
I'm hearing you there, Tracy. Yes,
Absolutely.
It's outweighs unconscious bias, but you're in that situation. So the statistic around a large percentage of the US who were in the survey basically said that even though they were of white origin, they didn't see that had worked in favour. But what was the alternative? They don't know any different.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I agree with you. It's different. Absolutely, totally agree with you. But what I'm saying is they must know or see the differences of how black people of colour, not just black, are portrayed versus white people.
They can see the differences, but they can't appreciate how it impacts them. They can't.
I guess that's the answer then, isn't it?
They don't know how
they don't appreciate how it impacts them.
How it actually impacts them
on a daily basis.
And that's why it's that unconscious. It's like unless a white person has been exposed directly to a bias around their color, it's always going to be secondhand for them.
Yeah, I guess so. But then also I would invite people, why they would have experienced the bias of not related to the color, maybe related to their ability, maybe related to their sex, or something else that's they identify with. And that's your taste of what it's like. I would invite you to think about that. But anyway, also says, so besides casting doubt on the idea that racial inequality exists at all, the comment also invalidates the lived experiences of non-white co-workers who deal with racial inequality as part of their daily lives.
I think there was I'm going way back and I don't know the source, but there was an experiment that was undertaken years ago where they took a small group of people and they basically gave them like latex masks
Oh, yes.
And they basically made them people of color, like people of color, and they put them out in for a day to see what kind of response they got. And they and the outcome of this was it really did open their eyes up to the kind of bias that people have.
Did it make people black?
On an everyday basis, yeah. They basically had a small group of individuals who were white, and they basically made latex masks so that they made them look like they were people of color.
Yeah.
And even like their hands and
yeah.
and then they put them out and they in the streets of the area that they conducted this social experiment. And the outcome was that the perspectives were just the eyes were opened.
Yeah, I just think it's really funny. And actually they did that with old people. Did they not make people really old as well? They did that.
They also did that. Yeah. So again, like you said, Tracy, that it can be a case of, you can basically have bias not just on color, but on age, on gender, on other factors and experiments like that. So I don't know the source, but I've seen it.
If you can find it, I'd love to watch it. If you can find it. Anyway, what to do really if you're in this position? And like I said, in my 20s, I would have just let it go or not said anything. Didn't want to open that can of worms. But what you could do is you could tell a co-worker that, acknowledge them. This person who maybe grew up poor has worked very hard to get where they are. You can say you work hard to get where you are, and explain that benefiting from white privilege doesn't mean they haven't struggled, because that's not what it means. It means their challenges may be economic, health related, or derived from another source, but racism has not been one of their burdens. And so if you think, even if you just take that as out, so everyone could be at the mercy of health issues, social issues, economic issues. They can every human being can have those struggles.
Yeah, everybody has a struggle. So
everybody has a struggle.
That's humankind. It's those struggles.
Exactly. But the added struggle of racism to overcome, to get where you want to be, is something else that shouldn't be part of the equation. Put another way, they haven't struggled because they are white, whereas people struggle because they are not white. And I think that's the point.
Yeah, but it's also how you frame that and what kind of tone you use and where you're coming from, because otherwise there's a risk of you coming across as though you're not validating what they're saying. Yeah.
So it's interesting because other people have other things they have to overcome. Absolutely. And even though it hugely benefits them, white privilege can be invisible to those who have it. And it's like you're saying, you don't see what you don't see, what you don't experience it yourself, you don't see it. And it's invisible. And I know I have heard people get almost annoyed with the term white privilege. And I remember, I read an article, and I'll forward it to you. I will not talk about it here because it was a very extreme rant about white privilege not being a thing. And essentially, this author concludes that everybody just needs to be nice to each other. So we don't need to go on about it. If everybody's just nice to each other, then everything's fine. Beautiful. That's the solution. If that was the solution, we wouldn't be where we are. Anyway, I'll send it to you.
I think that's like, so it's too George Floyd. It's like white privilege, George Floyd.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, that was that situation with George Floyd could have been avoided if we were just kind.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's I think that kind of perspective, that's living in fairy tale land, really. It's exactly. Like that's once upon a time and then happily ever after kind of stuff.
It says it's the privilege of not being treated with suspicion by store clerks or regularly pulled over by police. It can mean being hired over a Black candidate with similar experience, or getting a mortgage when a person of colour in the same financial situation is denied one. And this happens a lot more in
Yeah, and also actually there was a news feature that came up this week about a TV show coming on Apple TV. So, I think it's called Truth Be Told. It's a series that has been going on for a number of years, but this particular season of episodes, it's focused on, it's going to be based, or it's about to be based on a story around a group of young Black girls going missing, and the difference of media attention and workforce employed in the States to actually search for these girls.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So there's a clear difference there in between, yeah.
And it's sad, it shouldn't happen in this day and age. And so even when people know white privilege exists, they can be reluctant to admit it applies to them, can make them feel defensive and as if their own hard work is invalidated. And you get that, don't you? Because you're essentially saying you've had benefits I haven't to get where you are. And people don't want to hear that. I wouldn't want to hear that. So I get why there's a level of defensiveness around that. Yeah, because, you know, people may have had to overcome some very serious things to get where they are. So I totally get that. I just think...
And again, that's like a can of words, because that's a whole other episode and story.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's like, but at the end of the day, like I say, I have privilege as well. Well, I have privilege, and I'm still going to accept that I have that. I don't feel uncomfortable accepting that I have privilege where some Black people don't.
Yeah. Do you feel like you have? I hate to say this expression, but I'm going to say it one time. Do you feel like you've had best of both worlds?
That's another episode.
Yeah. Let's do that. That's a juicy episode, Tracy.
All right. So in What Would You Do? What would you do? That's my little jingle. It's terrible. But anyway. So this is highlighting a bias discrimination against women in the workplace. And we talked about women's rights. So I thought we may as well go with this example. So it's a workplace scenario. You're in a conversation with co-workers and someone without children asks a woman with children, how do you manage work and raising your kids? You must be overwhelmed. And you're not the person asking, you're just participating in this conversation. What would you do?
Right, okay. So this is a scenario where a childless woman is asking a mother who is working.
It doesn't say childless woman, this says someone without children. So it could be a man or a woman.
Okay, someone without children. Someone like myself, I'm a woman who doesn't have any children. It would be basically myself asking somebody in the workplace who has a child or many children, how do you do it? You must feel overwhelmed. Well, there's an assumption there that a person with children is feeling overwhelmed, but at the same time, you could also take it from the perspective that it could be a form of a compliment, whereby it's a case of a perspective of someone who is working, who doesn't have children, and is potentially and probably finding work overwhelming anyway, without the responsibility of looking after a child or children. And so simply sharing that comment, which is, you know, how do you do it? You know, it's almost it can be said in awe, because I know that, I mean, I've been in the situations where I haven't said it in that way, where, oh, how do you do it? You must be very overwhelmed. But I haven't said that, but I have communicated I have shared with my colleagues at work who have children, who are in the same type of role as me, who have the same pressures of me as work, but also have 3 or 4 children that they're also looking after and homeschooling. So I've asked them. Well, I haven't asked them but I've actually shared with them that, you know, I'm in awe of you. I'm in absolute awe of you, you know, because I know what the pressures are like in terms of just work. And so to imagine, which is all I can do because I'm not a mother, to imagine having the responsibility of 1, 2, 3 or 4 or plus other bodies of children that I also have to look after, on top of the responsibility that I have. For me, I'm in awe of that. I have that. And so in that situation, what would I do? Or I wouldn't necessarily, if I was a bystander and I heard that comment, I suppose in my bias, I wouldn't necessarily first of all see it as a negative question. I suppose in my own perspective, I'd see it as oh, the person asking it is probably coming from a position of great awe for this mother who's working and taking on those extra challenges. But also I can see how it would be taken out of context. But on the surface, I know that because I've made comments, but I've made compliments. I've passed a compliment to colleagues in the workplace who have the same responsibilities as me. And are also experiencing success, but I don't have the addition of the responsibility of a child or having children, and they do. So for me, I'm in complete awe of them.
Yeah, and I mean, everything is context dependent, right? So you're right, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I have commented similarly, but in the context of, because I've been a people manager and I was actually, you know, had people in my team that had to have that scenario working, because the work and stress increased during COVID in the industry I worked in, because we were providing a service essentially, and we needed to maintain that for patient safety, and well-being. So there was a lot of stress for everyone, and people were in lockdowns, kids at home, and so there was that happening. So yes, just in the two contexts I would comment on that, it would be checking on them. How are they doing? How are you doing? Because I know the situation at home, and knowing they're doing the best they can and not having high expectations of what they can do. Like, they can pay the same amount of attention and time, and just going with whatever they told me. So that would be in the context I would have that conversation, or say something maybe like that. But I probably wouldn't say you must be overwhelmed. And let's look at this from another side.
I mean, in that, if I was to say, or if I was to hear, oh, you must be overwhelmed, I think I'd be thinking also, would you also apply that to a female and a male? So I know that, because I know that when I've played, and I'm very aware of this, when I've paid compliments to my colleagues who are parents, as well as being successful in the workload that we both have, I've made comments to both mothers and fathers. So in that sense, I'm hoping I'm not discriminating in that sense. It's, for me, it comes from a place where I'm in complete awe that you're actually holding down this a very successful career, as well as having the additional responsibility of bringing up children. So
and I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right. I think that's the question to ask yourself before the words come out your mouth. If he was a guy, children, but would I be thinking and saying the same thing to him? And if the answer is yes, then, you know, that's okay. If the answer is no, then you're like, then you need to think about what your assumptions are. However, I'm playing out the scenario already, and I'm already assuming, and this is the other way, but a bias, still an absolute bias on my part, that I wouldn't ask a guy, because I'm assuming his wife's taking the work, even though she's working. Let's just assume I'm with a guy, potentially, who's married with kids, and this is a scenario, and I know they both work. I'm assuming that the woman's taking the biggest load. That's my bias. And that bias comes from having friends that actually do that, I'm afraid.
Right, I see. I suppose, I suppose in a way, we've been talking in this session about how we've been moving forward, and I know that I'm not going to mention any names, but one of my good friends, she's expecting a baby in the coming weeks, actually, and yes, she's going to be taking maternity leave, but she's going to be going back to work, and it's actually my friend's husband who's going to be taking time.
That's great. Yeah.
And so in a way, I suppose I'm already in an environment, I'm surrounding myself with, I've already somehow surrounded myself around less of that stereotype.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was also working in the industries that I have. In the last industry I was working in, there was a lot of paternity leave being taken. And so I suppose I'm just maybe it's because of what I've been exposed to.
Well, that's the thing. It's like your experience. It's still a bias. Like on my part, having that in my head, that's a bias, because I would know. I don't personally know, but I would know and have seen where it's the father that's taking on that responsibility sometimes, or, you know, taking the longest parental leave, say. I've seen it. I'm not saying I've never seen or heard of that, but my most common experience is the other. But anyway, what it's saying is, so it's good to highlight bias, because, you know, we all have it. And it's saying the problem with this question, when the question was, how do you manage work and raising your kids? You must be overwhelmed. The question reinforces an often unconscious belief that dedicated mothers can't also be dedicated employees. Because if you're using, you must be overwhelmed, suggests they can't cope. When you're overwhelmed, it's not a positive place to be in, is it? It's not a functional, it's not
it could also be, I mean, it's a word which also means it's quite challenging. You're feeling overwhelmed. It's too much to take on.
Exactly.
And so, there is because I think also the question is also dealing about, there's two responsibilities. There's the work responsibilities and the dedication towards that, and also the dedication towards raising children and looking after children. And you can do both, as society has illustrated. So
yeah, but that's the thing, and this is what's funny. I'll come back. Let me just read this though. It says it reinforces the unconscious belief that dedicated mothers can't also be dedicated employees. It assumes that the woman is overwhelmed, which can feel like a judgment on her ability to handle her workload, and may lead to her getting passed over for opportunities, if this is the bias held in the collective in the workplace. If this happens a lot, it can make women feel unsupported as working parents, which can make them more likely to leave the company. So, and it says many people, and it gives some suggestions how you can respond. It says there are a few ways you can respond based on what feels right. So like everything's context dependent, right? You can point out that feeling overwhelmed is something that everyone experiences from time to time. And I was actually going to say that some people have sick partners, some women have sick husbands, some men have sick wives, or parents that they have to have a responsibility towards. Some people are caregivers for other parts of their family, or are more involved with even extended family members, not maybe not immediate family members. So everyone at some point, even if you're a single person, has times when they feel overwhelmed.
That's right. You don't necessarily need to have extra responsibilities aside from work to feel overwhelmed.
Exactly.
Nobody goes through, there isn't one individual on this planet that goes through life and doesn't feel overwhelmed.
At some point, right? So that's one of the points you can make. And it's not just working mothers, you have a lot to manage. I imagine all working parents feel overwhelmed sometimes. And if your colleague doesn't seem overwhelmed to you at all, you can say that too. You're saying you don't seem overwhelmed. You seem to be managing it all in your stride. So that's more of a compliment.
That's where that sentence of "you must be overwhelmed," where you can turn that narrative and come from a place of compliment. Yeah.
And when it says many people fall into the trap of believing that women can't be fully committed to both work and family, and that fuels skepticism about women's abilities, and fathers are often exempt from these assumptions. So that's really talking about maternal bias, which is a thing. It's a thing.
Yeah, an interesting one.
It's an interesting one, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think if I'm also trying to think of a perspective of, okay, what would I do if I was receiving that comment? So I think I'd probably be inclined to see the compliment in the actual statement, but also if I didn't see the compliment in the first instance, I'd probably feel like I need to not prove, but kind of just show. I think I'd be inclined to show that I've got it down pat.
Yeah. The only reason you feel the need to do that is because you feel like it's a judgment.
Yeah.
So and actually, if I didn't do that, what you just did, I didn't put myself in the shoes of the receiver there, and now I did, and now I have. I feel judged, like the hinting that I can't handle it, and I'm also feeling like, well, how many women do this all the time? Like, why is this even a comment to me?
That's right.
Like,
Exactly.
so many mothers, nearly every woman in this office is a mother, maybe, I don't know.
That's it.
Yeah,
That's it. Yes.
that
Yes.
these are things I'm
And
thinking.
that would kind of that's why then my behavior would be like, well, I just show it. I just basically, I just basically show that, yeah, look, I can do this. I can handle this.
But you
So
shouldn't have to, because you shouldn't have to.
that's right. You shouldn't have to.
So interesting when you step into the different shoes, hey, how you can see the different perspectives. So that was it. That was our what would you could do. I really like that one. So thank you for your perspective and insights there.
I could share that.
It's basically, that question is not a compliment. If you want to compliment someone, that one is not a compliment.
It's the overwhelming effect of that, which negates it as a compliment. So if you take out that part about overwhelm,
maybe, I don't know. I'm still, now I've been able to sit in the shoes, or attempted to sit in the shoes, I'd still be a bit like, what was that comment coming from? Unless, like, again, it's context dependent. If I've been sat there complaining, having it offloading about my kids in the week and they're not having enough sleep, if I'd have been like offloading like that, and then there was a comment, the comment was like, oh, you're doing amazing, you're managing all this amazingly or something, that's a compliment. But if it's, how are you doing it?
I suppose that's it. I suppose it's about the tone that you use. It's about that word overwhelm. So, like, for example, like I'm a single female who has no dependents, and I have a career which requires me to work hard, sometimes work extra hours, and it requires my full commitment. And now I know that my counterparts are in that exact same position as me. The difference is that they have the additional responsibility of caring for a dependent or a number of dependents, also which requires their focus, which requires their attention, which I don't have. And so for me, because I don't have that, I appreciate that, and that's where that comment comes from. And I suppose it's a compliment if you use it, if you're being mindful of the tone that you use, and also using the word overwhelm in the right context.
Yeah. But you can also, well, there's a couple of things as a coach I would give as additional advice in this situation. And the first thing would be not to assume what somebody's feeling, because they say you must be overwhelmed. So you might be right, but just who knows, they know. So you can ask them, how are they feeling? How do you feel managing that? How is it working for you? And then they'll tell you if they're feeling overwhelmed, or they might not, depends how well they know you.
And you can apply that to anybody in the workplace. They don't need to be a mother. Like, you can apply that, like I could be a recipient of that type of comment. Is that, oh, you might be feeling overwhelmed. So
yeah. So you can just ask rather than assume. But also, if they're symptomatic of being overwhelmed, like you're seeing signs and symptoms, you can still ask and use the word. You can say, you seem overwhelmed. Is that what's going on for you? And, this happened. You seem a bit overwhelmed. So instead of saying you must be overwhelmed, it's still a possibility that there's something else, and that you're opening up the space for them to share how they interpret how they're feeling, not what you interpret how they're feeling.
Well, it's in communication where you say you must be, you're putting words into somebody else's mouth in a way. And so I suppose, and that communication error can be applied in any context.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean for this. Any context, I'm just giving that advice as a way you can communicate with someone about how they're feeling without telling them how they're feeling. That was it. I think it's a really interesting topic, hey? Had a lot of discussion there. What would you do?
Okay, what's this segment?
So what would you do is basically, I choose a scenario, but if you want to find scenarios and give them to me, that's absolutely fine. I'm happy with that. But generally, I find a scenario and I put it forward to you, and then you tell me what you would do, and we have a discussion about it. And it's obviously a scenario that is reflecting a form of bias and discrimination in the workplace. It could be in the workplace. It could, sometimes it's not in the workplace, but most of them are, because I take some of these from the Lean In organization, and I said I want to just repeat that. These I have taken from Lean In. It's a fantastic organization founded by Sheryl Sandberg, who essentially is an icon for what, and an ambassador for what we're doing currently. So the name of the book I read is called Lean In, and you're more than welcome to borrow it if you like. So anyway,
is her. Yes, it's Sheryl Sandberg. And
yes. So this is the scenario. So you are in a staffing meeting, and a co-worker recommends you put one woman on each team for better diversity.
Ooh.
What would you
do? Okay, so would that be her only reason for putting women on as leaders on each team?
She didn't say as leaders. She said put a woman on each team. And let's just assume that everybody's capable, because why would you have these women wouldn't be employees otherwise? So let's just say that. That's an interesting
question that you posed me, because I used to be in an employment position where I was putting together teams, projects, and building teams. And so, but I was never in that situation. Thankfully, I was never in that situation where I was advised or told or directed to select according to gender. Because when I was putting teams together, and this is the approach I'm going to take. Again, I'm kind of going back into my memory bank and thinking how I put teams together. It was all based on merit. It was all based on talent, and it was also based. Another factor that I remember that I considered when putting teams together was about progression and growth. Like when I'd be putting teams together, I'd be thinking, okay, well, if I put an individual in this particular team, is it going to be benefiting to what I'm aware of about their growth and their success and their opportunity? So for me, selection when it comes to teams is not based on gender. It's based on merit. It's based on a growth opportunity, and it's based on talent, and also in terms of personality, on whether or not personalities within each team are actually cohesive, or if there's going to be. How I would approach that, if I was directed and it was part of my job, I would push back by asking questions. I'm a questioner. So I would push back. If that was an order or which came from my directive, I would push back and I would ask, why is it necessary to put a woman in each team?
Great. That's what you would do. Good. Okay. So this is why it matters. 1 in 5 women report they are often the only woman or one of the only women in the room at work. These onlys have a worse experience than other women. They are more likely to have their abilities challenged and be subjected to unprofessional remarks. They may also experience extra pressure and scrutiny, and they can feel that their actions reflect on others like them. This takes a toll. So women who are onlys are 1.5 times more likely to think about leaving their jobs than women who aren't. So that's why it matters.
Right.
What you could do, and this, because you said, I get where you're coming from, because you don't want to discriminate based on gender either way. Is that the gist of it?
It's kind of interesting, because I think the key word for this episode of this podcast really is perspective. Answering that question, I was coming from my own perspective. I wasn't taking into account the perspective from a team where there would only be one female, and how would that make her feel? So I think the word perspective is really coming through here.
Yeah, well, yeah, I get exactly. And this is the suggestion, okay, is to applaud the spirit of the idea, but explain the downside of inadvertently isolating women on separate teams. Instead of adding one woman to many teams, recommend putting groups of a few women on teams together. And if you're in a position to do so, suggest that your company create opportunities for women onlys to connect with other women, such as networking groups. Also surface that this is a symptom of a larger problem. Your company likely needs to hire more women, so that it's not even an issue that you need to do that. And then it says why it happens. It says when women are underrepresented in organizations, as they often are, they tend to be spread thinly across teams, which means they stand out. And women of color are even more likely to be onlys. Since there are fewer of them in corporate America, and this is American stats, this underrepresentation can make the biases women face especially pronounced. With everyone's eyes on them, they can often be heavily scrutinized and held to higher standards. And as a result, they feel pressure to perform, on guard, and left out, and may be less likely to speak up and contribute fully.
Right, okay. I think, I mean, that's, oh gosh, really interesting, because I suppose with that scenario whereby if I was directed to put a woman in each individual group, that's a very top line approach, because what it's doing in that sense is like, so I answered the question, I answered that scenario by saying that it would depend on many factors. One of them was, I mentioned personality, about conflict, and also I mentioned about progression. And so if you're, I know, because I suppose I'm going to be sharing from my own experience, whereby I used to work in the advertising industry, and it's a very cutthroat industry, and there's some very strong personalities, both male and female, in that particular industry. But at the same time, there's also a lot of creatives who can be quite introverted. And so that's the idea of personality, whereby if you're putting teams together, you go on merit. And let's say, for example, there's a female in that selection group, and they are of a very strong personality. I wouldn't hesitate about putting that woman in a group where she's on her own with males, because I know she's got a very strong personality. She can hold that room, and she's confident in speaking her voice and speaking her mind and speaking her opinions. Whereas if I knew that there was a male who's more of an introvert and has lots of merit, that's when I would probably consider, okay, who else does this individual work well with? And I can put them both in the same group. And so it's a very top line scenario to only say, okay, because some women may not feel as confident on their own in a group, to then also tag everyone and tarnish every woman with the same brush.
Yeah,
it goes deeper than that, and that's why I'm saying it's top line.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's discussion. Really good point you make. Not all women behave this way, but this is talking about the stats and the standards existing in America when they produce these scenarios. And so what's interesting here, what I think this is really about, is it's about underrepresentation. So to even have to say, oh, can you make sure there's at least one woman in each team, means there's not enough women, because that should naturally happen when you're creating teams. If you've got, enough women in your organization, it should just be, it should just happen. So that's obviously why there's a need to have diversity in teams. Diverse teams, you're generally more successful. And like you point out, it's not just diversity of gender, it's diversity of personality, skills, merit, ability. That's absolutely a absolutely valid point. That's what you're looking at. But also you've got to consider that if you have underrepresentation, you may have, not always, women that haven't had the opportunity to show their potential or to reach their potential. See, that's something else to consider. And it's really good that that's what you would have done anyway with teams. You're considering people's potential and growth to grow. So that's wonderful. But I think specifically for this scenario, it's more about the fact there's already underrepresentation and looking at the other perspective of being the only woman in the team, which can have a completely different dynamic. because it's okay if you feel confident, you've got a voice. I've had this myself. Yes, I would consider myself very confident and very confident, happy to speak up. But if I feel, I'll be honest, if I feel that I'm the only, and there's a lot of other strong personalities, I'm not as confident to speak up. That's me. And like I say, like you say, you know, every woman is different. So I think it does help to consider that only factor and the impact it can have on the dynamics of people in a group.
Yeah, and I think you've definitely hit the nail on the head, Tracy, when you say about that scenario whereby, I said about, I question that, but you've hit the nail on the head when you said about, well, that situation it's probably only come about because there's not enough women there in the first place. So in essence, it's about going back to the origin.
Yeah. Well done. That was your first. What would you do?
Wasn't so bad. So again, it's great food for thought. And again, we've slightly digressed, but yeah, definitely. And it takes me back to my previous advertising days when no scenarios. But again, in the world of advertising, especially nowadays, and I was very fortunate enough to work for an organisation where there was representation. In fact, a majority of the departments were led by women, and that wasn't deliberate. It was again all based on talent and merit, and it just happened to fall that way. So, and I was fortunate enough to work for an organisation that obviously celebrated diversity.
That's great. That's really fortunate, like you say. Yeah. All right, that is it. That concludes us because we are a bit over.
Right, okay.
So, thank you. And it was a pleasure. Your first podcast was a wrap.
That's right. It's that was really very enjoyable. So definitely I'm loving the fact that it raises so many questions and lots of thoughts and lots of digression happening there. So and I'm hoping that it will get people thinking and chatting and discussing. So great.
Oh yeah, live it up. All right, well, we'll be back next week for more discussion and chatting and thinking. See you later.
Bye, Tracy.